USA. I'm also president of the International Forum and an executive committee member of the World Federation of UNAs. The United Nations was chartered 75 years ago to help establish collaboration and cooperation among nations for the shared goal of peace. The United Nations Association was established by Eleanor Roosevelt to mobilize for civic action to promote the mission and vision of the United Nations. The Global Engagement Online series, known as GEOS, brought to you by UNA USA, is a unique way to connect our members and the general public with the United Nations. Please note that this session will be recorded. I will be joined by UNA USA Senior Director, Farah Eck, and Communications Officer, Sarah Hopkins. They will help to monitor the question and answer box, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and they will assist during the session with polling procedures. Today, we're honored to have as our panelists very distinguished representatives of United Nations organizations. I'm joined by Kevin Cassidy of the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, Nguyen of the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, and Jyoti Sanghera of the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. The bios of our speakers can be found in the link in the chat box. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. This GEOS session follows the recognition yesterday of the World Day for Safety and Health at Work 2020. Governments, employers, workers, and their organizations face enormous challenges as they try to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and protect safety and health at work. Beyond the immediate crisis, there are also concerns about resuming activity in a manner that sustains progress made in suppressing transmission. COVID-19 has been considered both an equalizer and at the same time a breeding ground for inequality. And today our guest speakers will touch on the rights and access to life and livelihood. Before we begin, let's share who's in our audience. So Farah, can you please provide directions on how we will conduct polling during our session?
Thank you, Tita, and welcome to everyone. First, please note that if you have a question at any time during the session, please utilize the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen and not the chat box. We will not be monitoring the chat box. So in order for us to understand and provide context for who's listening in and to see if and how COVID-19 has any financial impact, we'll be asking you to respond to a series of poll questions. On the screen, if you have logged into the session using a computer, you should now be able to see our polling demographic question number 1. Please select the region in which you currently reside.
You're going to wait for the polling question to come up?
Yes, they are polling. We'll give a few more seconds till a majority have been able to vote. Perfect. So I'm going to end polling and share the results. So you should be able to see that the majority, 41% of our attendees currently reside in the Northeast. Okay. All right. For our next question, please choose the best description of your geographic location. And I'll give a few seconds to respond. Okay, and it looks like the majority with 61% reside in urban, 33% indicate semi-urban, and 6% of our attendees indicate rural. So now for our third demographic question, this one related to your age bracket. So I'll give a few more seconds for responding. Excellent. And it looks like by a slim majority, 33% of the attendees are between the ages of 51 and 75. Next is under 26 with 26%. And then slightly less with 25% is between the ages of 27 and 40. Okay. So going to demographic question 4, please choose the answer that best describes your identity. Just a few seconds for that. Okay. So an overwhelming 71% indicate as female on today's session. So that's very interesting. Now, beyond our demographic questions, we have 2 livelihood-related questions. So as of today, please indicate how you have been impacted, if at all, by COVID-19 in regards to finances and livelihood. And there are 3 options there below. Okay. So we have a majority, 60% have indicated that they have not been significantly impacted by COVID-19 from a job or financial standpoint. And then our last question, thank you for bearing with us as we get to know a little bit more about our attendees. My lifestyle has changed from COVID-19 because I now, and please select the best response. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, so it looks like the majority, again, the difference is that they work from home and depend more on delivery services for food and other necessities. Thank you everyone for participating in this understanding of who our attendees are, and I'll turn it over now to Tita.
Thank you so much, Farah. So to our panelists, we've just heard the percentages in our audience, which is probably a microcosm throughout our nation. So for each of the panelists, if you can answer the questions, what strikes you about the data that you're seeing here as it relates to the lives and livelihood of our audience members? And how can you relate this to your respective organization's mandate? So Kevin, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you very much, Tita. In terms of the data that was coming in, looking at those who were not affected by COVID-19, and then the high percentage of people who are in the older age bracket, I think it indicates how work is structured through the different generations. So I believe younger people who are on sort of less secure contracts, maybe in the platform economy, may be more impacted upon it. Those who are doing coding and so may be immune from that because this is it's not a face-to-face activity as well, but I am interested to see that we have a lot of people who are in the older age bracket and that there are people who are not impacted by COVID. That was my first reaction.
Okay, great. Okay, Jyoti, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, no, that was very interesting. I was very encouraged and struck to see that 70% of the audience there is women. And I'm not really surprised. This is indeed an issue which has a lot of women in the forefront. As you will notice, a lot of the healthcare workers are women. those providing care at home are women. So that there should be such a large representation of women in the audience is interesting, but also understandable. The age bracket of either very young people, the youth, or the older persons is also very interesting, and and the fact that they are not really impacted by the COVID in terms of livelihoods does speak to a group of people that are not employed in the formal sector, or are either self-employed and working from home and are not then impacted that much. Home delivery services is also an interesting aspect because people are confined to their homes and they're receiving services at home. So this is largely a group of people that are economically and financially not severely impacted by the crisis. And that's very interesting to see, but also very concerned on account of the fact that they have joined us for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. And An, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it was a surprise to me. From the personal perspective, I felt like, wow, okay, I'm part of the group. I can relate to that. But from Ukraine, I think I would agree with you. It's a microcosm in the fact that where I'm working, there's parts of Ukraine where we're dealing with subsistence living, and so the impact is great. An example is just one of our colleagues, or a friend of a friend. She's a cleaner, and she cleans for internet business, and since they shut down, she now is unemployed, and this is to me more of what I'm seeing or hearing, at least in Ukraine, even at the urban areas. And you can only imagine what that's like in the rural areas where people are much more dependent on actually some of the subsistence things that they can do to be able to survive day to day.
Right.
So I feel myself lucky, very lucky.
And even in terms of when we're looking for those that have jobs that can be transferred to at home, like many universities, they can have jobs that go to the home, but for those that either don't have access to internet or don't have jobs that can be converted, it does present a major problem. And our audience today pretty much reflects the group that would be able to do a transfer of their job responsibilities home, perhaps. Very good. Thank you so much. We're going to go into our other segment where we're going to ask specific questions of our panelists based on their organizations. So I want to start with Kevin. As the International Labor Organization sets labor standards, develops policies, and devises programs to promote decent work for all men and women, what's the most helpful to understand whether or not a person has the right to choose to work?
Thank you very much. I mean, it's the ILO is a rights-based organization. We are set the international standards in the world of work and have since 1919. The right to work is embedded within our Constitution. So everybody has the right to work over an age, those who are in the working age. So we eliminate child labor and issues as such. It's also reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I believe it's Article 23 that speaks about the right to work and conditions of work. So small sidebar, UDHR drew upon the ILO's constitution as one of its framing documents. So we are one of the lucky organizations that has the ability to set those rights. So what are we looking at for work? Work is the way in which we connect with reality. Work is the way in which we earn a living. Work is the way in which we communicate with others and how we deal with social problems. It's a unique entry point between the nexus of the social and the economic. So work is very important to us writ large as a species. People have been working, have always been worked, whether it was a subsistence farmer in a rural area or somebody working in a company or at a small business in a big urban area as well too. But COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact upon that. And what we've been seeing right now is the equivalent of almost 305 million jobs being lost. This is based on the lost hours. This is a tremendous impact on the world economy. We've also seen nearly all of the 1.6 billion informal workers being impacted as well too. So right is about the ability to live, to be able to afford the goods and services that we need. And through the COVID-19, and rightly so, with the procedures that have been in place to reduce the spread of the infection, that people have been, social distancing is probably not the right word, but physically distancing, I think, is a more appropriate term. We don't want to look at social exclusion issues on this. But it has meant that people are drawing upon their savings. People are not able to go out and earn income. And in many economies around the world, where informal economy is the major part of their GDP or earnings, they are lost income that will never come back to them. 1 in 5 people around the world actually are eligible for unemployment benefits. 1 in 8 around the world has access to what we call social protection. This is food, active labor market policies to find jobs, education, health, nutrition. So when you put that together, work stoppage creates tremendous dislocations and creates problems not only that are within the family, within the society, but within the country, because problems in economics spill into the social sphere, which spill into the political sphere, and we are in a situation now that we need to take very serious moves in order to get ourselves back to work in a healthy and safe environment.
Okay, well, Kevin, let me just do a quick follow-up, because we do at some of the state capitals, people protesting not to alleviate the stay at home. They want to get back to work. They're saying it's their right to work, where the states have said, no, it's unsafe. So how do you balance that?
Right. I think we have to pay attention to the science on this. And I think this has been stated quite forcefully, is that if in fact this pandemic requires us to be staying at home, I think we need to do so, right? Because if we have greater rates of death, and I'm sitting here in New York City myself, which seems to be the epicenter of the fatalities on this. And quite honestly, I'm hearing stories from friends and colleagues. I have actually lost 2 family members to COVID-19, and a number of other friends have expressed the same problem. So we do need to follow the science. It is creating dislocations. We are the lucky ones that we can distance work, although not everybody can. How can you distance work as an electrician, or as a security guard, or as a bus driver, or a train driver? So not everybody has the luxury of doing that. And the way that our environment is structured today, unfortunately, the essential workers are the people who are probably the least well paid, who have probably none of these benefits. There are many people in healthcare, for example, even here in the United States, that do not even have healthcare themselves. So I think we have to measure it between the two, but there has to be social protection measures. There has to be wage replacement for people. There has to be benefits that people have in terms of being able to access the medicines and recoveries that they need. So the right to work doesn't mean that we just go out and we work. And it also doesn't mean that just because I want to go work that I should, because you are not only putting at risk yourself, but many other people around you. So it does require a bit more sense and looking at the larger picture on this.
Great, thank you so much. And I know that that's at the top of our list from what we're seeing on the news and what we're seeing in some of the demonstrations, and the greater concern for the greater good in many of those situations. Thank you so much. Jyoti, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, along with dozens of UN independent rights experts, have said human rights need to be front and center in response to COVID-19. Can you break down what this should mean in terms of national responses and supporting people's livelihoods, including when people are social distancing and as millions have lost their employment? And also, can you discuss specifically the role of including gender perspective in these efforts? And this is an interesting question, given what our polls just showed of our audience. Jyoti?
That's right. That's right. So listen, the COVID-19 pandemic has created an unprecedented human and economic crisis. It's amazing that we are in this state in our lives and on the planet at this moment. Governments are taking strong steps, enforcing quarantines, testing populations, introducing fiscal stimulus plans, and temporary social protection programs such as income, food support, subsidies to utilities and care services. Now, the question from a human rights perspective is, are these measures by states and countries and other actors consistent with the human rights commitments of these countries? Do they include populations who have thus far been left behind, excluded by the development and economic agenda? Do they exclude further? And these are very important issues because we really need to attend to them at this moment. On Monday this week, that is the 27th of April, the Secretary General launched the UN framework for the immediate socio-economic response to the coronavirus. This framework consists of 5 streams of work, and it is an integrated support package offered to countries by the United Nations Development System to protect the needs and the rights of people living under the duress of the pandemic, with particular focus on the most vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable groups, including women, and people who risk being discriminated and left behind. This framework will guide the UN's in-country work over the next 12 to 18 months, and I would say it aligns significantly with the High Commissioner for Human Rights' vision of human rights being at the front and center of responses to COVID-19. Now, let me specify how, as it will answer the question regarding national response to support lives and livelihoods. The framework requests that UN responses to COVID-19 as well as recovery plans post-COVID be guided by the country's human rights commitments. This requires a human rights lens in advising on socio-economic impact assessments of the measures, emergency measures, protecting the most disadvantaged groups in their lives and livelihoods, which includes health, social protection, work, food, water, housing, all of the package of economic and social and cultural rights. This program, this response also grounds responses on the 2030 SDGs agenda and demands prioritization of discrimination and inequalities, starting with a quick but comprehensive mapping of those who are most at risk of being excluded and left behind. Now, this is an area of work where, since the beginning of the crisis, my organization has already produced significant results. This framework gives us space to go deeper with our national partners on the analysis and on the response, and in particularly centering women in the responses. This response of the UN also emphasizes the participation and access to information, free speech, and other civil and political rights that are an integral part of the UN socioeconomic response for safeguarding social cohesion. It refers explicitly to risks of overreach of emergency powers, heavy-handed security responses, and risks to freedom of expression and association. The framework also requests that the Build Back Better or the recovery phase be used as an opportunity to depart from models that have chronically used underinvestment and or have sort of chronically underinvested in health and other rights, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights, that have led to spiraling inequalities and environmental disasters. This is a moment where we need to move away from business as usual and seize the historic opportunity to encourage recovery plans that place people's rights and the environment at the center. This provides us with space for analysis and advocacy on the human rights components. And finally, the framework requests that the United Nations Development System continues to assess the human rights impact of the coronavirus pandemic along with governments and the extent to which responses respect human rights by using 10 thematic human rights indicators which have been developed by my office, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. These indicators are meant for the use of the entire UN system to inform and support country analysis, advice, and programs. So this new response, which has been launched this week, is very much grounded in human rights. And together with all the UN agencies, we hope to place at the center the lives and livelihoods of people who are most impacted by this crisis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jyoti. And certainly as we look at our population demographics globally, we see where the percentage of women are, and especially in some of the countries where women are the majority due to several factors such as war and so forth, and also due to many of them are working the marketplaces. So that's where the gender perspective comes in most critically. And as you mentioned earlier, and also as Kevin mentioned, who are in these work positions, the healthcare, the nursing, things like that. Well, thank you so much for that response. Okay, Anna, I'd like to bring you in on this. The IOM Constitution recognizes the link between migration and economic, social, and cultural development, as well as to the right of freedom of movement. What is the reality for migrants who, even before COVID-19, do not have stability in terms of housing, food, and work? And what options or opportunities do they have now?
The simple answer is grim in terms of the perspective. I mean, just some global numbers from the World Migration Report that IOM publishes regularly. We have an estimate of 272 million international migrants. Part of that includes 164 million who we would consider as migrant workers. And I think that's the number for us to really take a look at. Part of that 272 is also something because we're also working from the humanitarian context, are internally displaced persons from natural disasters or from conflict. And their lives are also impacted, and even more so, especially with the pandemic. I think what the pandemic has really emphasized or showed or highlighted is the impact of migrants within the economic fabric within the country, and it shows what an important part that migrants play within that from an economic perspective. You see right now that even though that they're within the European context, there's closures at the borders across, even within the Schengen zone. You see the high need and the gap that shows within the healthcare sector, which are largely a large portion of that support within the countries are from migrant workers. You also see the need right now for agricultural workers, and there's a high demand, and there's been exceptional cases where there's been some discussions or there's actually been some processes to actually charter seasonal workers from Ukraine to other parts of Europe just to be able to meet those demands that's happening right now to pick strawberries, for example. And so I think one of the things that we see is that before the pandemic, we were talking a lot about the vulnerabilities and the lack of social protection that's afforded to migrant workers, because in reality, a lot of them are also irregular, as we say. I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to try and show this little picture like this. It's just an aerial of basically the day before the closure of Ukraine, of the borders between Poland and Ukraine. There was over 100 Ukrainian migrant workers that were trying to get back in within 1 day, and I think the Border Service did a great job in terms of trying that, and so luckily that line or that mass of people disappeared within a day, but it shows the the amount or the impacts that especially within the context of Ukraine, how many migrant workers are actually abroad. We're talking about actually 10% of the population and more than 30% of the GDP. And so now with the lessening of the economic opportunities, you're also seeing impact back at home in Ukraine because the remittances aren't there, but then they're also potentially stuck in countries where they're already vulnerable, now without resources. And then their families, which they're trying to support back home, also don't have the resources as well. And so, I'm sorry for being pessimistic, but it's quite grim in that. But it also, again, highlights the importance of migration or how it plays within the fabric of the economic situation in each of the countries.
Okay. I'm sorry. And in terms of when we talked about last year and the year before, the great crisis at the time, of course, was the refugee crisis, the movement of people, and now it's compounded. COVID globally. How has that impacted your work or the office, what the office has to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's, if you take a look at and it's not just the refugee movements, it's part of the thing that we've been talking about was the movement of migrants and refugees, and depending on how you define migration or migrants. But a lot of them are in camps. They're situated and they're isolated. And that's been one of our biggest fears from a humanitarian perspective. What happens and how do we provide those types of support within some of these camp settings, to ensure that there's proper hygiene and there's proper health protection and measures for some of these camps. And so I think that's something that is very much highlighted. If you mention that, I'd also reiterate the IDPs may not necessarily, internationally displaced persons may not necessarily be in camps, but they, within the context of the conflict in Ukraine, they are the most vulnerable when you're talking about economics and when you're talking about livelihoods. And so now the opportunities that are for them are even less, and they're even a smaller, their options or their opportunities are less than the host communities. And so, I think those are the areas that we need to take a look at. And that's why I think that taking a look at the economic and the livelihood perspective is a very, very relevant and important thing to take a look at from the midterm and long-term perspective as well.
Great, thank you so much for that response. I'd like to go to Jyoti. There are people joining our call today from across the country in big and small cities, as well as urban and rural areas. What's your advice for participants to use the resources from the UN, whether from OHCHR, the Secretary General, or UN Special Procedures, to ensure a human rights approach to COVID-19 is prioritized? And also, how does advancing social and economic protections also support fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals? You had mentioned those earlier, so this is sort of picking up on that again.
Yeah. So in addition to the framework I mentioned and explained earlier, the SG, the Secretary General, has also issued a number of guidance documents very recently over the past month on human rights, on gender, on older persons, on children and youth, on persons with disabilities, on migrants, and a number of other issues. Which are available on the UN site. These are public documents freely available. The High Commissioner for Human Rights too has put out similar guidances on these very issues, including also on civil and political rights, right to assembly, right to free speech, freedom of expression, on journalists, and the special procedures, mandate holders, the special rapporteurs and independent experts have also done so. Only today, a guidance came out or a statement came out from the special rapporteur or the independent expert on debt, international debt. There has also been guidance and advice from independent experts as well as the High Commissioner on lifting sanctions, albeit even temporarily on countries which are under sanction, because this is further adding to the distress, the economic distress and humanitarian distress in these countries, including in Iran, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and a number of other countries. The 2030 SDGs agenda has also been aligned to the new urgencies facing us today. So I've outlined a number of these issues in my previous response, but particularly in relation to the populations left behind, such as women, you know, persons with disabilities in the rural areas, the poor, the older persons, youth who are unemployed, as well as others who are unemployed, indigenous people, and so on and so forth. Let me additionally outline two of the issues that are of significance here, which have strong human rights underpinnings. Now, the first one is public health care. It's absolutely critical that we invest in public health, and not only for emergency support. Governments need to ramp up public health expenditures as a priority. Indeed, at the moment, respirators, tests, masks, gloves, all of that is necessary. But countries need more than that, more than just emergency support. What is needed is universal health care worldwide. However, there's a risk that as governments become indebted due to their tanking economies, they will continue with austerity cuts and privatizations that have been eroding public health systems already in recent years. And this would run the risk of returning to a situation where millions are further excluded from healthcare. So we all need to watch out and advocate for universal healthcare. The second critical issue that you also mentioned is, of course, social protection. And my colleagues from IOM and ILO have already alluded to these. Providing social protection, income, and food support to people in the current moment is vital. These measures are extremely urgent if people are to be quarantined. In developing countries, we see upwards of 70% of the people work in precarious situations in the informal economy, and physical isolation is not possible, as my colleague from the ILO said. So households are and will suffer from hunger with no income. Given these precarious living conditions of workers in the informal and gig economies in most developing countries, policymakers should consider the need for universal social protection floors. So we need to extend emergency measures such as food and cash transfers to all who are in need, with a view to protecting people from hunger and descent into poverty and destitution. Protection from longer term impacts of the pandemic as well as future shocks must include minimum income for all, universal health coverage, and universal social protection. I think at the moment and in the long term, these are very critical. Under the human rights commitments, there are minimum core obligations in relation to economic and cultural and social rights that all countries have committed to under their international human rights law. And these include ensuring access to minimum essential food, which is nutritionally adequate and safe to ensure freedom from hunger for everybody. It also means ensuring the right to access to employment, especially for disadvantaged and marginalized communities and individuals, enabling them to live a life of dignity. It also means ensuring free and compulsory education to all, as well as social security schemes that provide a minimum essential level of benefits that cover at least essential health care, basic shelter, housing, water, and sanitation, and other necessities which are of absolute need, particularly for those who are in the discriminated sector. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for addressing those issues. And our final question in this segment, before we go to the audience's Q&As, is for Kevin. Around the world, regardless of the country, there are jobs which are considered essential and stay-at-home restrictions or work-from-home policies do not apply. How does one person's right to work impact another person's right to a healthy workplace? And you alluded to this a bit in your earlier comment, and I just wanted you to have the opportunity to sort of expand that a bit.
Thank you very much. Certainly our main objective is to ensure the protection of the worker themselves. There is a desire to go out and get things moving again, and certainly we all see that the economy is taking a big hit. This is no longer just a health crisis, it is a social and economic crisis. We need to be following the prescriptions. There are very good guidelines that are out there from WHO and other institutions. Most of the workers who are in a formalized workplace will have very good guidelines from their employer. We work through employers' organizations and through trade unions to make sure that these are followed. But as I mentioned before, most of the world is in informal employment or in precarious jobs themselves. So what do we need to do? So my organization has been working with a number of other UN agencies as well as the World Bank and international financial institutions. So the responses we need are in 4 areas. So protecting the workers in the workplace. We need to strengthen our occupational safety and health measures. We need to have health access for all, which as was being mentioned by Jyoti just a few minutes ago, falls in the social protection floors. We need to adapt work arrangements to teleworking where it can happen. And we need to find the sequencing of workers so that you can minimize the spaces between it. I think we've been seeing in the abattoirs and the food processing plants that people are very packed together, and that's now impacting upon our food supply chain. We also need to expand access to paid leave, and we need to also fight discrimination and exclusion, not using this opportunity to let go, say, for example, women or persons with disabilities. We need to ensure that people who can and want to work actually do retain their jobs. Secondly, we need to stimulate the economic and labor demand through active fiscal policies and accommodative monetary policies, lending and financial support to specific sectors, especially to the health sectors. Thirdly, supporting employment and incomes, extending the social protection for all, and this also looks at income substitution, but also measures to protect employment through either short-term work leave, paid leave, or sequencing of jobs, or job banking. Also financial tax relief for the micro and small enterprises. And lastly, the most important aspect, and the ILO not only is a normative agency, a UN agency, and a technical agency, as well as an international economic actor, we are a tripartite group that works with the government, workers, and employers that allows dialogue, communication between the workers and the employers to find solutions and to provide strong foundations for these measures. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists at this segment in terms of providing that information, especially from their perspective organizations. We're now going into our question and answer period. You've submitted questions, and I will turn this over to Farah to share with us the questions that have come in from our audience directed to our panelists. Farah?
Wonderful, thank you. This first question is for Kevin. To what extent are you considering inequality?
I think we may have lost Farah's sound, but I will jump in and finish the question for Kevin. So the question is, to what extent are you considering inequality in access to technology and technological literacy in your assessment of the changing nature of work and who gets left behind?
Yes, you know, technology and access to technology has been a problem since the beginning of the technological revolution, which started really back in the 70s, but technological changes have always been with us, depending on how you determine what technology means. The idea about bringing technology to more people as the nature of work changes takes a heightened priority. Because, for example, you would not be able to telework if, in fact, you did not have the modern conveniences of a Zoom chat, of a WebEx connection, even internet access as well, too. Even our colleague here sitting down in, I believe, in Washington, is unable to finish the question because there was a bandwidth issue as well too. So it's not just a problem for a developed world, but also a developing world where technology is slowly introduced. And the reason for that largely becomes that it becomes a political calculus, that if technology is added in because it's there, so for example, looking at mechanized farming in sub-Saharan Africa, where millions of people, tens of millions of people are small shareholder farmers, who need the technology to get better prices for their goods, who need to be able to be predictive on the weather and their investments. Not having that technology puts them at a serious disadvantage and constrains their markets. So without a doubt, we do encourage, we do work with workers and employers and governments around the world to encourage them to put more technology in place. And the pandemic of COVID-19 has laid bare those holes in our fabric, not only in the social safety net, but also access to work in these remote locations. Again, not all work can be done distance-wise, and we have to look at that as well too, but we are looking at it on these many different levels, but access to technology is certainly a priority for the ILO.
Okay, the next.
Yes, and so the next question that we have submitted by the audience is for An. So this question is, COVID-19 will clearly exacerbate income inequality and suffering of refugees, women, and people already affected by extreme poverty. How are UN member states and the US in particular responding to this challenge?
I can't speak for what the U.S. policy is. I can share a little bit about what we're trying to do, at least at the country level, as an example of what we're trying to do more broadly as a framework. And you know, as you all know, tackling inequality isn't like a cookie cutter approach. And so what we're trying to do is really take a look at the different disaggregated needs of different populations or different sectors or categories of people. And in doing that, we're trying to take a look at, for example, something that Kevin had mentioned as well in terms of, you know, how do you do or provide economic opportunities for some of these different populations. An example would be an IDP in Eastern Ukraine. One of the things that we're also trying to do is it's not just about, and this is the one thing that I'm really trying to push towards, is more of a development approach. Because it's not just about providing somebody with immediate livelihood opportunities to an individual, but it's also taking a look at engaging the investment sectors and the finance for even creation of small businesses. And I think the big issue right now is taking a look at how do we work with the private sector to develop or create jobs. And in doing so, how do you start taking a look at encouraging at the community level, not just the economic side, but the social side, in terms of making sure that we have the access and the services needed for those people as well. And so that's the way that we're looking at it, but that's also very much consistent with what we're taking a look at within, you know, not leaving anyone behind within the SDG framework and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. The last question we've selected from the audience is for Jyoti. So the question is, to what extent are you looking at the ways that the changing nature of work, so for example, telecommute, will affect the employment and unemployment rate for people with disabilities?
I think that's a very good question. I think there are positives and negatives here, and it also depends on what kind of disability the person suffers, what income bracket the person is in, whether the person is in an urban or a rural setting, in a developed country or a developing country. So there are a number, and whether the person is a woman, is an older person, is a younger person. So there are a whole slew of interconnecting identities which impact upon this. So let's say if this is a woman who is of a middling age or a younger age, And she has a disability which renders her, blind, let's say, for instance. It would be very difficult if she's telecommuting and is in a poorer income bracket, if she doesn't have access to the kind of needs or the community setup which aids her in proceeding with her work. If the person is in a younger bracket and has another kind of disability, let me tell you, I have a colleague in my team who is in a wheelchair, and on account of telecommuting, he was being assisted by a person because he's completely dependent. He was being assisted by a person, an assistant who came from another country. So for this colleague of mine to continue with his work and to telecommute as well, he had to go with his assistant across the border to Spain because he could not be on his own and continue to work or live in a manner that he was accustomed to. So persons with disability are extremely dependent either on others in the family or other assistants, depending again on their disability. So I think it would have to be, the kind of support would be provided to ensure that this person continues to live with dignity and to work at the level that this person would like to work. It would be pulling in communities for community help, pulling in families to assist with this person's continued work, and pulling in private sector, pulling in, the public sector to assist this person. So telecommuting, depending again on, let me underscore, the disability is a very complicated scenario and would have to be assessed on a person by person, disability by disability context. And that's all I can say at the moment, but I would really like to say, before I close, that the human rights of this person with disabilities should be at the center of any measure that one looks at, both to ensure that this person continues to work and continues to live a life of dignity in these very challenging circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you, Jyoti. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for the great questions. We'll move on to Tita.
Okay,
thank you. Wrap us up.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, audience, for the questions. They were very in-depth and very pointed. And this brings us to the close of this GEO session on life and livelihood during COVID-19. We thank our panelists, Kevin Cassidy out of New York, Jyoti Sanghera out of Switzerland, and Nguyen, who's out of Ukraine, for joining us for this important and critical discussion. All of us here in America, as well as throughout the world, are caught up in the crosswinds of trying to navigate in this new tide as, quote, the new normal. We have and will be impacted for years to come. It is for us to determine how we will move forward as a nation and as a world. The UNA USA is proud that we as an organization have over 200 chapters throughout the United States, which provide opportunities for people to engage in civic action, to address such issues as global health, education, climate change, gender equality, to engage and work toward the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, our global goals. In celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the Secretary General has requested that nations engage in global consultations or global conversations, voicing what we are concerned about as a nation and as a world, voicing what we want the world to be in the next 25 years. We invite you to join in the global conversation through our UN 75 consultations. These will be held in each state throughout the year. Please visit our website at unausa.org to find the schedule for your state. The UNA also invites you to be part of this great civic action by joining the UNA. You can access our membership information on the website. And as the UNA USA, we are the only organization whose sole mission is the support and advocacy of the United Nations. We support the goal of peace, the responsibility of civic action, the belief that what affects one directly affects all indirectly, as Dr. King said, and the hope that our tomorrows will be better than today. So join us in this commitment. The GEO session today is one of many that the UNA is offering throughout the year. The next one will be held on May 6th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The information is on our website. You can register at the website. So we look forward to your joining us in our programs and in our webinars and joining us in the commitment to creating a better world. So thank you for joining us. Stay safe, stay well, and this ends our webinar.